In this video, we're going to load an existing C# application that you'll actually build in a later lesson. And we're going to then use that to introduce you to several features of the IDE, the Visual Studio IDE, show you how to build and execute that Painter app, and then we'll just take the app for a quick test drive as well. Now, before you can proceed in this lesson, you do want to make sure that you've already watched the Before You Begin lesson to make sure your system is set up correctly with the software that you need, and also to make sure that you've downloaded the source code examples and extracted them onto your system. Recall from the Before You Begin lesson that we assume you extract the examples into your user account's documents folder underneath a folder called examples, and within that examples folder you're going to find individual folders that correspond to the lessons in these live lessons videos and also to the chapters in our corresponding college textbook and professional book as well. So go ahead now and navigate into documents, then the examples subfolder, and then the CH01 folder. There you'll see Painter, which is the app that we're going to be loading, and within its folder is a so-called solution file that has the file name extension .sln. Now on your system, the .sln may not appear, but you should still have the icon to the left of the name of the solution file, which indicates that this file is associated with Visual Studio. On Windows 10, if you want to show the file name extensions like I have here, you can go to the View menu and just make sure that the file name extensions checkbox is checked. The same thing is true on Windows 8 as well. If you're running on Windows 7, then you'll have to go into the menus for Windows Explorer. I believe it's in the View menu where you have access to the options for viewing files, and one of those options is to show the file name extensions. Next, we'll actually load the project into Visual Studio, and to do that we simply double click the .sln file, painter.sln. Now that launches Visual Studio automatically because the .sln file extension is associated specifically with Visual Studio, and when the solution gets loaded, all of the contents of that solution get loaded and displayed over here in what's known as the Solution Explorer. Now, if by any chance the Solution Explorer is not displayed on your screen, simply go to the View menu and select Solution Explorer, or type Control W followed by an S to display that window within the IDE. Now, as you might expect, there's various menus in the IDE. There's a toolbar with various options on it. We will talk about lots of those menus and toolbar options in subsequent lessons. Here we just want to focus on the Solution Explorer and getting this app up and running. Now, within the Solution Explorer, we have the Painter project, and if I expand its node, we can see various contents from that project. And we're not going to be looking at any code in this example. We just want to show you that the files are there. A solution can contain more than one project. The vast majority of the solutions I show you will contain only one project. However, when we get to the database lesson in particular, at that point we will see a solution that contains several projects, and as you will see, those projects all share some common code, and that's one of the reasons that we place them all into the same solution. Now, when you have one project in your solution, its name will appear in bold, and that bold indicates the so-called startup project. When you have many projects within a solution, only one of them will ever appear with a bold name. That particular one is the startup project, and that's the one that's going to execute when you tell the IDE to execute the app. Next, we want to build the app so that we can execute it. Now, I'm going to take a look at this point at the Build menu, and within that menu you see that we have several different options at the top of the menu here: Build Solution, Rebuild Solution, and Clean Solution. When you're working on a large project, once in a while Clean Solution can come in handy to tell the IDE to remove all of the code that it has generated, and also to remove any compiled source code files so that you can rebuild them from scratch. In particular, I've found over the years that once in a while I'll make a change to some code, tell the solution to build or rebuild, and yet some change that I know I just made is not showing up in the running application. So at that point, I typically clean the solution and then rebuild it. If in fact that doesn't satisfy or solve the problem, I will sometimes restart the IDE itself. Now, for most cases, you can simply say build solution. What this is going to do is, since the last time you built your project, any code that has changed will be recompiled, and if there are other source code files that are dependent on those changes, those too should be recompiled. If there's anything that doesn't need to change, then it will simply reuse the compiled versions of those particular source code files, and that shortens your overall build time. On the other hand, rebuild solution is going to rebuild all of the files associated with your project, and that could be a larger amount of overall time depending on the size of your project. Now, in our case, we're simply going to select Build Solution, at which point it displays this output window at the bottom of the screen with some information showing us that our build succeeded. The number 1 means that there was one project that needed to be built and it succeeded. No projects failed to build. No projects were up to date and therefore ignored as part of the build process, and nothing was skipped as part of the build process either. So now it compiled. There's no error messages being listed down here, which means I can go ahead and try to run my application. And there are several different ways to run the app. We can go directly to the toolbar here where we see the Start button, and what this is going to do is start the application running in debug mode. As you can see here, debug is selected. If I'm running in debug mode, that's one of the things that you'll typically do when you're testing an application and you want to be able, for example, to step through the source code and see it in action. Perhaps you want to profile your application to look for areas that are taking up too much CPU time or too much memory. All of that stuff can be done via the debugger and the tools of the IDE that get displayed to you or become available to you when you're running an app in debug mode. Now you can also go to the debug menu where you'll see Start Debugging, which is the same as clicking that icon on the toolbar, but you'll also see here Start Without Debugging, which says to run the application basically in release mode, meaning this is what the app's going to look like to an actual user once they install it on their system. Now, when we run the app in this example, it's irrelevant whether we choose Start Debugging or Start Without Debugging. We're not going to see any differences between those for the purpose of what I'm showing you in this video. However, when we move on to Lesson 3 in particular and start covering console-based applications that run in a command prompt window, at that point we're going to want to use Start Without Debugging or Control plus F5, which will enable the window in which the app runs to stay on the screen once the app terminates. With a console application in particular, if you run it in debug mode, what's going to happen is as soon as the app terminates, the window will disappear, and in some cases that means you won't even get a chance to see the program's output because it will kind of flash onto the screen and disappear immediately. So in this example, I can choose either Start Debugging or Start Without Debugging, and in both cases, here I click Start Debugging, in both cases it's going to launch the application in a separate window. If you select Start Debugging, you'll also see various tools show up in the IDE that can be used for debugging purposes. Now, the app itself is pretty straightforward. It just allows you to drag the mouse to draw. And just to show that this is indeed a separate window, I'm going to minimize my IDE here. You can see down the left side we have various controls, and if I drag the mouse to draw, it just follows where I draw, and the faster I move the mouse, the farther the distance between the dots on the screen, and that's because of the sampling rate of the mouse itself on my system. It doesn't change the sampling rate the faster you drag your finger across a touchpad or the faster you move the mouse. And since this app is just displaying little circles based on the size setting that you've selected, it's going to sample the mouse's point, draw a circle at that location, sample the mouse's point, draw a circle at that location, and it will keep doing that as long as you're dragging the mouse. Now I can clear the entire drawing. I can drag again and undo one of those circles at a time, so as I keep clicking it will keep undoing. And then I have some settings that I can choose from here, such as let's say I want to do red and a large circle instead. I could start drawing and we could write something like welcome, just to show you that we can draw here. So obviously a little bit hard to draw with the mouse. On a touchpad actually is what I'm using here, but there's welcome, and we can say 2, and we'll do C# as well. And I apologize for the poor graphic attempts here, and maybe we'll throw in an exclamation point. So there's our first example up and running, and we've gotten a brief introduction to the IDE. One of the reasons I like to do that is throughout these live lessons videos we use what we like to call our live code approach to present examples to you. One of the things I will do in the subsequent lessons is show you each application running before we go ahead and look at the source code for that application, and that way you get a complete sense of how the application works before you start developing it.